Let's start with Lies of P. It's one of those games that takes a classic story and flips it into something totally unexpected. I mean, a dark, twisted version of Pinocchio? Who saw that coming? From the moment I started playing, I knew this wasn't going to be the fairy tale we all grew up with. Instead, it throws you into this grim, steampunk world where everything feels eerie and dangerous. The atmosphere is on point. There's this constant tension in the air, like you're never quite safe, even when you're just walking through a quiet alley. The game wears its inspirations on its sleeve, and if you've played Bloodborne or Dark Souls, you'll feel right at home here. The combat is that familiar, deliberate style, where every swing of your weapon matters, and timing is everything. But Lies of P adds its own twist with the weapon customization system. You can mix and match blades and handles to create your own combos, which gives you a ton of freedom to experiment with different builds. It's honestly so satisfying when you find a combination that just clicks with your playstyle. The enemies are no joke. Each one feels like a real threat, and you can't just rush in and expect to button mash your way through. You've got to be patient, learn their patterns, and strike when the moment is right. And the bosses? They're some of the most intense encounters I've had in a while. Every time I thought I was getting the hang of things, a new boss would come along and completely wreck me. But in the best way. It's that feeling of frustration followed by pure joy when you finally take them down. If you're into challenging combat, Lies of P is definitely worth your time. It's one of those games that stays with you. Next we have Assassin's Creed Unity. I know it got some heat when it first came out, but these days it's actually kind of a hidden gem. Paris during the French Revolution is just incredible. The city feels so alive with all the chaos of that time period. People rioting in the streets, vendors yelling, revolutionaries everywhere. You really feel like you're in the middle of it all. What I love most about Unity is the detail in the city. The way they've recreated Notre Dame and all the landmarks is just breathtaking. I mean, it's Paris. Who wouldn't want to explore every nook and cranny? Arno, the main character, gives off that classic Assassin's Creed vibe, but he's a bit more relatable. He's got this personal revenge story going on, which feels pretty typical for AC, but with the revolution happening around him, it adds a lot more tension. And the whole romance thing with Elise, I thought it was a nice touch, gave the story more depth. And let's talk parkour. The parkour in Unity is easily the best in the series. It just feels so smooth. Running through the narrow streets, climbing up buildings, it's like you can feel every jump and movement. Escaping guards or just free running across rooftops never gets old. The customization is a major highlight too. You can kit Arno out with different outfits, weapons, and abilities. Whether you want to go full stealth or just dive into combat, it's totally up to you. The freedom to shape how you play is awesome. Oh, and the co-op missions. I had so much fun with those. Running heists with friends, trying to coordinate attacks. It's pure chaos in the best way. Nothing goes to plan, but it's hilarious when it doesn't. Next we have Mafia Definitive Edition. Alright, so I just finished this game and honestly I'm still processing how good it was. You know when a game just sticks with you? That's how this one feels. I've always had a soft spot for the original Mafia, but this remake? Wow, they really outdid themselves. It's like stepping into the 1930s for real. First off, the atmosphere. I don't know how they nailed the vibe of that era so perfectly. The city of Lost Heaven is just alive. Every little detail, from the cars to the buildings to the music, it really pulls you into that world. There were moments when I just wanted to drive around and take it all in, not even worrying about the mission at hand. Like, who knew 1930s radio stations would get me this hyped? And the story, it's not just a typical mobster narrative. You really get invested in Tommy Angelo's rise in the Salieri crime family. It's like playing through one of those classic gangster movies, but you're in control. I actually found myself sympathizing with him, which is wild considering, he's a criminal. But the voice acting, the facial expressions, it's all so believable. It draws you into the point where you care about these characters, even when they're making some seriously bad choices. Gameplay-wise, it's got that nice balance between action and story. Sure, there are shootouts and car chases, but I think what got me hooked was how well-paced it all felt. It doesn't rush you. The combat feels more polished this time around too. And the driving? I never thought I'd say this, but driving those old-school cars was actually fun. Next we have Rise of the Tomb Raider. This game really took me by surprise in the best way possible. I mean, I knew going in it was going to be a solid game, but it actually exceeded my expectations on so many levels. First off, the environments are stunning. Every single location feels meticulously crafted, from the frozen Siberian mountains to the hidden tombs. You really feel like you're on this epic adventure with Lara. I found myself just stopping to take in the views at times, which isn't something I do often in action games. And speaking of action, the combat and stealth mechanics are incredibly satisfying. You get this perfect blend of intense firefights, sneaky takedowns, and crafting that just keeps you engaged throughout. There's this real sense of progression, too. By the end of the game, I felt like Lara had grown so much, not just as a character, but in terms of abilities. You can craft your own explosives, improve your gear, and upgrade your skills, so it feels like you're always evolving. The game nails that feeling of being alone in the wilderness. There were plenty of moments where I felt like Lara was up against impossible odds, but her resilience kept pushing her forward. There's something really inspiring about that. It's like you're constantly in survival mode, scavenging for resources, battling enemies, and fighting the elements. I have to say, the tombs themselves are a standout. They're optional, but trust me, they're worth exploring. Some of the puzzles had me scratching my head for a while, but that moment of solving them is so satisfying. Next we have Resident Evil 3 Remake. Definitely one of those games that's way better than people give it credit for. Seriously, if you haven't given it a shot or maybe dismissed it because it's shorter than other Resident Evil games, you're missing out. It's packed with intense moments, killer gameplay, and one of the most relentless enemies in the series. You've got Jill Valentine, who is such a badass, going through Raccoon City as it just falls apart. The whole city is basically on fire, zombies everywhere. And then you've got Nemesis. My God, Nemesis. That thing is relentless. Every time you hear him coming, that music kicks in, and it's like your heart rate just skyrockets. You think Mr. X from Resident Evil 2 was bad? This guy's next level. The thing I love about RE3 Remake is how fast-paced it is compared to some other Resident Evil games. It's way more action-heavy, and Jill feels like she's always moving, always surviving on the edge. The balance between survival and action is super well done. And there's still that classic Resident Evil inventory management, where you have to decide like, do I take more health or more ammo? I love that dilemma, because it makes every decision feel critical, especially when you've got Nemesis chasing you. And speaking of that, the combat in this game feels tight. It's satisfying when you nail those perfect dodges, and then counterattack. The dodge mechanic is probably one of the things that makes Jill feel so agile compared to Leon or Claire in RE2. You really feel like you're evolving with the gameplay as you get better at dodging zombies. Next we have Dead Space Remake, a game that completely revitalized a classic survival horror experience and honestly deserved a shot at Game of the Year. The original Dead Space was already a masterpiece, but the remake took it to another level, with modern graphics, tighter gameplay, and some amazing quality of life improvements. It was like stepping back into a nightmare, but with 4K visuals, and even more horrifying details. First off, the atmosphere in the Dead Space remake was next level. The USG Ishimura felt more alive and dead than ever. Every creak, every shadow, and every flickering light just added to that sense of dread. The developers did an incredible job preserving what made the original so terrifying, while also cranking up the immersion. They rebuilt the whole game from the ground up, and it showed in how polished the environments were. The lighting alone made certain sections feel way scarier than before, like you're always one step away from something terrible. But here's the thing. While the Dead Space remake was stunning and faithful to its source material, some people argued that it didn't do enough to push the genre forward, which is probably why it didn't take home the Game of the Year trophy. It was a fantastic remake, but it stayed close to the original's formula, which, for some, felt more like a tribute than a bold new experience. But here's the bottom line. The Dead Space remake did exactly what it set out to do, remind us why this franchise is one of the best in survival horror. The fact that it didn't win Game of the Year doesn't take away from the fact that it was one of the most polished and terrifying games of 2023. Next we have Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. This game is just pure fun. I thought Insomniac nailed it with the first game, but playing as Miles? It's like they cranked up the cool factor. From the moment you start swinging through the city, you feel that difference in Miles' style compared to Peter. He'd got that younger, more energetic vibe, and the way he moves those little spins and tricks mid-swing just makes it so satisfying to swing around New York. The story got so much heart. You can really feel the weight on Miles' shoulders, trying to live up to Peter's legacy, while figuring out what kind of Spider-Man he wants to be. He's got this personal connection to Harlem, too, and that adds a really nice, grounded layer to everything. It's not just about saving the city. It's about protecting his community, his friends, his family. I felt way more connected to his journey because of that. Plus, the combat is so slick. Those venom powers, absolute game changers. It never got old to just zap a group of enemies with a venom punch and watch them go flying, and combining that with his stealth abilities made for some really fun, creative fights. I'd go from sneaking around, taking out enemies one by one, to just leaping into the fray and unleashing chaos with his electricity. The combat just flows so well, and it's super satisfying to pull off those combos. Even though it's a shorter game compared to the first one, I honestly didn't mind. It felt like the perfect length for Miles' story, and I loved every second of it. And the ending, without spoiling anything, it just left me feeling hyped for what's next. Next we have The Last of Us Part 2. Now, I know this game stirred up a lot of heated discussions when it dropped, but let's be real, some of the hate was totally overblown. First off, people were divided right from the start due to the story direction. Without getting into spoilers, it's safe to say that the game took some big narrative risks. Naughty Dog didn't just play it safe with this one. They were like, nah, we're going all in. And while some fans weren't ready for those changes, that's exactly what makes the game bold. It wasn't afraid to challenge your emotions and expectations, and not every game dares to do that. Also, let's not forget how incredible the gameplay and world building are. Whether or not you agree with the story choices, the game is undeniably polished. The combat is intense, the environments are stunning, and the small details make the world feel lived in. Those aspects of the game were universally praised. And for good reason. The AI is surprisingly smart too. Enemies react to your tactics, work together, and even call out to each other by name, which makes it feel way more personal when you're in the thick of it. It adds this extra layer of immersion that's hard to ignore. Ultimately, The Last of Us 2 was unfairly hated by some, but over time, people have started to recognize its strengths. It's one of those games where, once you let go of the preconceived ideas and just take it for what it is, you realize how well crafted and powerful it is. I think a lot of the initial backlash came from the hype and expectations. People had this picture-perfect idea of what a sequel should be, but Naughty Dog went a different route.